Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to start discussing a period of American history, well, truly world history, known as the Cold War. But really, America's part in it is our focus, of course. And so this is an era that's going to last from shortly after World War II until the early 1990s, when, here's a spoiler alert, America wins. Okay, so those of you that weren't around when the Cold War ended, America won it. But this is an era in which both my parents and I grew up, and so this is a period where the prevailing attitudes and issues and ideas and fears and concerns and culture are easily within living memory. And so that makes it kind of interesting to study because this is something you can ask about. One of the questions I often get asked when we talk about the Cold War is, well, what is a Cold War? And so what makes it cold? So let's talk a second about Cold Wars versus hot wars. Okay, World War II was a so-called hot war. There's direct, open, widespread military conflict between two or more antagonists. That's a traditional war, sometimes called a hot war. Okay. On the other hand, a Cold War does not have widespread, open military conflict. If there is military conflict, it often uses proxies. Someone in their place stands in for them. It's often instead a political and or economic struggle. And in the case of this particular Cold War, it was definitely political and certainly economic because it was between two different political economic systems. On one side, you have the nominal democracy and capitalism of the West, and on the other side, you had the autocratic communism, which is both political and economic, of the East, of the Eastern Bloc. Okay, and so the conflicts that take place then are covert and indirect rather than direct confrontations, generally speaking. And this is specifically because neither side, especially in this one, wanted to escalate it to a hot war. Well, let me rephrase for just a moment. Most people did not want to escalate it into a hot war because they realized very quickly that that would be a sure route to destruction for everybody. Now, wars are fought for reasons, and Cold Wars just as much as a traditional war. And so the question is, why did they do this? And it was to answer the questions that are here, critical post-war, and by post-war we mean World War II questions. And the first is, under what conditions and in whose interests would the Asian and European balances of political power be maintained? In other words, is it going to be for the benefit of the capitalist West or for the benefit of the communist East? And how would the developing nations of the world then take their places in a society of nations as fully independent modern states? So beyond the more industrialized areas of Asia and Europe and North America, what that's saying is in those other places, in the parts of Africa, in the Middle East, and parts of Asia that weren't industrialized, in South America and Central America, all these other countries, well, how are they going to develop it? Into whose sphere will they fall? Is a big, big question. And answering these two questions as part of the rivalry there is what forces the United States to maintain a level of involvement in world affairs that we had never done up to that point before. We've talked about this before in class, how the United States had traditionally kept a very isolationist, insulated, not our problem sort of attitude towards the world. We had traditionally kept a very small armed forces, between wars. And what we would do is when a war began, or just as it seemed like a war was going to begin, we would start recruiting and building up our forces, go fight the war, and once the war was over, everybody go home. Now, that happened in World War II to a degree, but we did not draw back down anything like what we had done in previous wars. And remember that in 1939, the United States Army was smaller than the army of Romania, which is a little small, relatively speaking, Eastern European country. They had a larger military than the entire United States because we kept very small militaries. That partly goes way back to the American Revolution, which was 1301 subject, but partly goes way back to that because the British had used their army to enforce their laws, which we didn't like. We looked at them as a tool that could be used to oppress us. And so we, as Americans, had traditionally, until World War II was over, had traditionally looked at a large standing army as more of a threat and an unnecessary expense than as something we needed to maintain. After World War II, because of changes in technology, because of changes in communications, and because largely of the Cold War, the United States has to maintain, or has maintained, a much larger military and a much larger presence in foreign affairs of the world. World War II catapulted the United States into the role of superpower. We really had the ability before the war, we just didn't have the desire to do it. Now, what we have is a fear that if we don't take that place, someone else will. And really the only candidate coming right out of World War II to take that place, because Britain is faltering, the only candidate for that is the Soviet Union. Okay, so in February of 1945, pretty much everybody except Adolf Hitler knew how the war was going to end. Hitler was so crazy at this point, he was ordering non-existent divisions to go to places where there weren't any enemy troops because he had no idea what was going on. Anyway, he was way off in La La Land by that point. But the big three, that's Churchill from the United Kingdom, FDR from the United States, and Stalin for the Soviet Union, will meet in Yalta, which is a city in the Crimea in the Soviet Union. And they're going to discuss there and work out their plans for after the war, what's going to happen. And here's the thing, they've got some principles. The two Western countries have principles based largely on what Woodrow Wilson had tried to achieve back at the end of World War I, which is a peace that will last. They want to go more with the 14 points than the Treaty of Versailles had. So They wanted to, in particular, encourage self-determination and create a new version of the old League of Nations, one that would have some more power, some more authority, some more ability to actually influence events rather than simply make recommendations and things. The problem is the Soviets don't want to do that. Now, they agree on the United Nations, the basic concept of the United Nations, everybody agreed to. Stalin wanted to have each of the Soviet socialist republics, there's like 18 of them, that make up the USSR, get to be a separate vote, of course, because he thought the United Kingdom would get the ability to do so with all of their colonies, Australia and Canada and so on, which were no longer technically part of the United Kingdom as direct colonies anymore. They were independent nations. But he wanted to have each of the Soviet Union's republics be recognized as an independent country, and that would have given the Soviet Union basically 19 votes, each of the SSRs and then the Soviet Union as a whole. And Churchill and FDR were like, no, I don't think so. And so he settled for 3. The Soviet Union collectively, including Russia and everyone else, the Ukraine SSR, and the, I believe, Belarusian SSR. Anyway, the big thing that they disagree on, though, is self-determination for Eastern Europe. And by self-determination, what I mean is that the people that live in the areas would determine what form of government they wanted, who they wanted to rule them, how they wanted to proceed, what, did they want to stay joined politically with other groups? For example, the Czechs and the Slovaks, who don't really care too much for each other, had been put into Czechoslovakia by World War I when they broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the Slovaks had always been sort of dominated by the Czechs, and they kind of resented it. It's why they sided with the Germans during World War II. Anyway, but would they be allowed to determine those things for themselves? Stalin says no. Stalin wants to maintain a very strong influence over the territories that his nation had, in quotes, liberated from the Nazis. And I say that he liberated from the Nazis. It's true that he pushed the Nazis out, that the Soviet Union pushed the Nazis of Germany out. But they had their local Nazi parties, their local fascists were still around, and which was a thing in many of those places. But what he wants to do is keep control over them. And this is the area of Eastern Europe that we're talking about. And I'll show you on a map here in just a little bit, but it's the part that's going to fall on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, which is a phrase that Winston Churchill will popularize. Anyway, he wants to hold on to those because he wants a buffer state. He wants a buffer zone to protect the Soviet Union from invasion. Russia and the Soviet Union have fought 2 major wars already in this century and been devastated by both. And Stalin doesn't want that to happen again. He's still scared of the Germans. He's scared of Western Europe. Remember, he is a paranoid schizophrenic. He's terrified that if everybody's not under his thumb, then they're plotting against him and seeking his downfall and death. He's every bit as nutty as Hitler was, just a little less obvious about it. Anyway, so he wants these buffer states to protect the Soviet Union from invasion. To get some of the things that he wants in concessions, however, from Churchill and FDR, he finally agrees to allow free and unfettered, that was the phrasing of the conference's wording, elections. But he doesn't honor that agreement in the case of certain countries, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Not surprisingly, all of them fall under the sway of the Soviet Union after the war. One of the reasons he gave up on that, or that he agreed to that, was because A, he knew he wasn't going to actually carry through with it, and B, FDR and he were a little closer than most people would like to think an American president would be with a communist dictator, and FDR basically sold out Churchill. He had promised Churchill way back in the Atlantic Charter that he would stand by the United Kingdom and help protect the interests of the United Kingdom in Europe. And when this comes along, he totally drops Churchill and says, "Sure, Stalin, you can do what you want in these countries," and that's basically what ends up happening. After the meeting in Yalta, not long afterwards, just a few weeks actually, FDR will die. And if you saw the photo of them sort of in the background on the last slide, you noticed how sort of wore out and tired FDR looked maybe. It's because he was in the process of dying. He was just wore out, and he died of natural causes, really. But he was just wore out. And so Vice President Harry Truman becomes president. Now, Truman is not FDR. He was a running mate that was chosen for political reasons. They actually didn't necessarily see eye to eye on a lot of things. One thing about Truman is he is not a slick customer. He is very plain spoken and blunt. And so when they meet again, when the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, and it's Churchill and Stalin still, but now Truman instead of FDR, meet at Potsdam, which is over there in Europe, in July of 45. Truman is going to raise tensions between the United States, the Western Allies, and the Soviets because he hints at the atomic bomb. He says something along the lines of, well, though we've defeated Germany and we no longer have to worry about them, our scientists have developed a weapon of such terrible magnitude that the Japanese will be forced to capitulate. But he didn't come out and exactly say what it was. He said, we have a secret weapon that will do it. Now, Stalin knows what we've got. He's got spies in the U.S. He has spies in the Manhattan Project that helped create the bomb. So he knows what it is. He doesn't know how it works, and his scientists are going to spend quite a lot of time and effort trying to recreate the atomic bomb. But he doesn't know what they've got. Now Truman, like I said, he's not really very good at subtlety. And Stalin, while he thinks he's trying to be subtle with it, Stalin misinterprets that, and he says that in his mind, that he was being dishonest. And this makes Stalin even more distrustful of the West, which is not great. And here's another political cartoon. You know how much I love my political cartoons. We got Harry Truman talking to Stalin and his foreign minister Molotov. And he says, why can't we work together in mutual trust and confidence? See, look at all these wonderful things we're talking about, while he's holding on to the atom bomb, which only we had. The Big Three had agreed to create the United Nations, however, and they actually have a meeting in San Francisco to sort of come up with the organization of it. The fellow who presides over those meetings is a guy by the name of Alger Hiss. He's assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State, or he had been at Yalta. I think he got promoted from there. And anyway, so he worked for the State Department. He would later be accused of espionage. Personally, I think he did it. They couldn't prove the espionage case, but they could prove that he lied about things like whether or not he'd ever been to communist-oriented meetings and things. So anyway, Alger Hiss helped to set it up, just sort of an interesting character. He always maintained his innocence, but I don't think he actually was. I think he did it. So anyway, but they agree, and they get several countries, 51 countries, to agree to meet. They begin operating in October of 1945, so just after the war is over. They are headquartered in New York City, still are. There are now, when I typed this up originally, and it's been a few years, it was 193. I think it may be 195 now. The purpose of the UN is to foster peaceful international relations. That's why they exist. And they're replacing the older and relatively ineffective League of Nations, which had been created by World War I. Big difference, this time the U.S. agrees to join. very important. Um, and the other is that part of it is that they're going to have what's known as the Security Council. Part of the UN Charter created an organization within the UN known as the Security Council, which has power over certain sanctions against member nations and the peacekeeping forces. And the idea is their job is to help maintain world peace. As part of all of the agreements, they created 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China. So that's basically the 5 largest countries that were on the Allied side of the war. Now, this is, by the way, China at the time, still not the People's Republic of China. China was not communist at this point. China was actually in the midst of a civil war, which had really been going on for over, well, a couple of decades. They sort of put it on pause during World War II to fight the Japanese a little bit more than each other, but they still fought one another. This is the nationalist Chinese and the communist Chinese. At the time, we recognized the nationalist Chinese as the legitimate government of China, and so it was nationalist Chinese that were there, not communist Chinese. Anyway, so these 5 permanent members can veto actions of the council as a whole. Any one of them can say, nope, we're not doing that. And it vetoes the entire process. I believe that there are a total of 18 members now. So 13 other countries, and that rotates. That changes every once in a while as to which other countries have seats on the Security Council. But those other countries don't have the veto, and again, they rotate. They're not permanent. And so the Cold War is going to begin. And there's various interpretations about why it began. The traditional interpretation has always been that it was a response to Soviet expansionism. The Soviets had always, ever since they were first created, well before World War II, they had always basically said, yeah, we're going to expand, and communism is the Communist Manifesto that Marx wrote says it's historically inevitable that all nations will eventually become communist. It's the best system that there is. We're going to expand everywhere. So there'd already been that fear. And now with the Soviets being so strong as a result of the war and some of the help we'd given them during the war and things, and their actual expansion into Eastern Europe, we were very concerned about them expanding elsewhere. The revisionist view, which started to become popular honestly in the 90s, is to focus on Soviet vulnerability. That is, that the Soviets started it because they were scared of us, which is also partly true. I think the United States really did have a reaction to the Soviets' expansion, but the Soviets expanded because they felt vulnerable. So it's a mixture of both. If you ask me, it's sort of the two. Yet another, not as popular concept though, is that, to be honest, the United States and Russia before and the Soviet Union afterwards never did get along really. We didn't like Tsarist Russia back under the Tsar in the 19th century, all through the 1800s. We had looked at them as sort of backwards and just the worst form of autocratic aristocracy under the Tsar, with the divine right of kings and all that great stuff. And so we had never really gotten along well with them anyway. And so some people like to focus, we're never going to get along with them. So Truman and his administration take a hard line against this Soviet expansionism. And one of the things that they do is they create the Baruch Plan. Okay, it brought up by a fellow whose last name's Baruch. That's why it's called that. Anyway, the idea was we promised to eliminate our own nuclear weapons. We would get rid of our A-bombs. But everybody else had to promise not to develop them either, so that nobody would have atomic bombs, atomic weapons. And of course, the Soviets said no to that. In response to that, we suspended Lend-Lease. We stopped lending them new equipment, leasing them military equipment and machinery and all of that. We cut off their supplies from the United States. And then we tied any economic aid that they would get in the future to them pulling their troops out of Eastern Europe. And so this looks to the Soviets like, see, they're planning to gang up on us. They're getting ready to come after us. They don't even want us to be able to defend ourselves and things. So you see how that sort of starts to feed into that paranoia, right? And paranoia is a big thing during this era. Okay. After 1947, the administration and pretty much every presidential administration afterwards is going to become focused on this concept of national security, that they have to provide for the security of the nation. And by that, they mean our governmental system. And so again, this is just spelling out sort of what was going on with the Soviets and why they expanded and created that buffer zone of Eastern Europe. Stalin doesn't want to be invaded again. He wants a buffer between Soviet Union and Western European nations, especially Germany. He is not willing to let Germany rebuild and be strong and a threat to the Soviet Union again. He just is adamantly refuses to do that. And so the buffer that he's creating is going to consist of all the Eastern European nations that Soviet troops had entered while pushing back the Germans, including Germany. Okay, including Germany itself. And Stalin is going to use the old Comintern organization to help to install puppet communist governments in all of these countries. He'll actually even help in another country, Yugoslavia, where a dictator by the name of Tito Broza takes over. But Tito is unusual. Although he is a communist and he's a pretty hardline commie, he does not want to fall under the sway of the Soviet Union. And so he refuses really any help from the Soviet Union once he gets into power. Once he manages to get himself into power by wiping out all the Chetniks and the other freedom fighter groups who had fought against the Nazis, he and his partisans take over Yugoslavia, and he begins to run it how he wants to, and he tries his best to stay between. He's not going to sidle up and get friendly with the Western capitalist nations, but he wants nothing to do with being dominated by the Soviet Union either. So he has got to kind of balance himself out. The U.S. and the West want to rebuild Germany in order to prevent a repeat of the radicalization caused by desperation after World War I. Radicalization breeds desperation. But Germany was devastated by the war. We had been bombing them, that is the U.S. and the British, night and day, literally for years. We had blown up their factories, their railroads, all of their infrastructure was damaged. The Soviets, as they invaded from the east, just did incredible damage. They stole everything that wasn't bolted down, and if they could pry it up with a tractor, it wasn't really bolted down well. They stole machinery. They moved entire factories out of Germany and moved them to the Soviet Union. They destroyed farms. They wrecked roads and bridges, and they did it all on purpose. So Germany's in a really bad way, right? Massive unemployment. People are broke, they're hungry, and they're starting to get desperate. And so the U.S. wants to avoid that, which might cause a resurgence. And man, I remember the good old days under the Third Reich when we all had food. The Soviets, on the other hand, they're feeling very much like the French after World War I, and that they want to be paid back. Soviet Union had been damaged severely by the Germans as they came in, and now the Soviets want to get paid back for it. And that's kind of part of why they were doing so much wrecking things. And like everything else, they come to a compromise. And what they do is they divide Germany up into 4 occupation zones. One for the United States, one for the British, one for the French, and one for the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets get the biggest part. The Soviets would receive limited reparations. They actually end up stealing more than they were ever supposed to be given. And Berlin itself, the capital of Germany, lies in the Soviet zone, well into the Soviet zone. If you recall, the Western Allies had let the Soviets take Berlin for 2 reasons. One was political, one was practical. Patton wanted to get it so bad, but he was denied, made him furious. But politically, it was because it made nice with our so-called ally, the Soviet Union, who had suffered so much loss through the war. And practically because capturing Berlin cost a lot of lives. Berlin was very heavily defended. And so the Battle of Berlin cost the Soviets tens of thousands of lives. And that was a price that the American and British governments and military leadership weren't willing to pay, just for the sake of saying, yep, we're the ones that captured Berlin. Anyway, but so Berlin, while it sits in the Soviet zone, it's also going to be divided up into 4 zones, into 4 parts. And the 3 parts of West Berlin, that's the US, British, and French zone, American, British, and French zones, make up West Berlin. And it stays democratic. So it's what's called an exclave. That means a small piece of something that's in the midst of something else. They became an exclave of democracy in the midst of communist East Germany, and they stay that way for decades. And the East Germans and the Soviets hated it because there were jobs, there were luxuries that the Easterners didn't have, there were, and there was freedom. I mean, that they did not allow their people. And it was obvious and right there in front of everybody. A lot of people who lived in East Berlin actually crossed over into West Berlin and stayed. It didn't go back, and they moved to the West. And it's actually going to prompt the East Germans, the Soviets. The East Germans did it, but the Soviets told them to build a wall all the way through Berlin, cutting off the East from the West. And it was known as the Berlin Wall. Very The Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961 and it came down in 1989. But here you can see a small stretch of it where the cemetery is on the West Berlin side and the so-called death zone was on the right-hand side. And that's the area that was cleared by the East Germans under Soviet dominance to keep people from getting to the wall. You've got a watchtower. You would have had armed guards there all day, all night, with a big searchlight up on the top. So if anybody tried to cross, they could spotlight them and shoot them. And they did. Here's just a map of what Germany looked like divided up. The green zones were British, the blue zones were French, the yellow zones were American, and the red zones were Soviet. And then the inset is the city of Berlin. And you can see West Berlin divided for the French, the British, and the Americans was West Berlin and under the Soviets. And later, of course, East Germany is the Eastern Berlin. So the Soviets have expanded. How do we respond? We respond with a new system called containment. By 1947, the West develops this strategy to deal with the Soviets, and it's based on an idea advanced by an American diplomat living in Russia, working in Moscow. His name is George F. Kennan, and he writes a report known as the Long Telegram, because it was a kind of long telegram that he sent anonymously, by the way. He didn't put his name to it at first, that said, here's the idea. If the Soviets push to expand, we either push back or threaten to expand in another region to force the Soviets to pull back. And Kennan and a lot of other Americans, including Truman, believed that communism was unstable and would eventually collapse on its own if it was prevented from spreading. This is the same idea, for example, that Lincoln had essentially about slavery. He said it's not a stable system. It's not going to last if we can keep it from spreading. And so Lincoln's original plan had been to contain slavery, not allow it to spread any further. And that's basically what the containment plan is for the Soviets, or for communism, is to not necessarily try to overthrow the places that already were communist, but to let them fall apart on their own, and that they would do that as long as they weren't allowed to spread. Now, Stalin believes that the West, under our leadership, is in fact the aggressive side, because, well, Stalin's nuts. And so he looks at this concept of containment as a threat. Neither side trusts the other, one tiny bit. And so this containment policy, it's going to be very long lasting. It basically becomes the root of U.S. policy, foreign policy, for the next 50 years, until after 1991. When communism basically falls apart. And so President Truman embraces this containment policy as a cornerstone of our foreign policy. He says that if not stopped, totalitarian communism would continue to spread and eventually threaten the U.S. Therefore, the United States has a national security concern anywhere there's a struggle against communism. This is what's known as the Truman Doctrine. And basically, it says that we can therefore provide support to any free people who were resisting attempted subversion by armed minorities or outside pressures, as Truman put it. That means communism. It says that a threat by communists anywhere in the world is a threat in the long term to the United States, and so we have a national security interest in preventing the spread of communism. And so it's in these post-war years that America will begin to take the lead in containment, in opposing the Soviet Union. We're not alone. We do have allies. The British are our allies throughout this time period. The French, kind of lukewarm off and on about it, but definitely Britain. And Britain had been a world superpower up to and really through World War II, but World War II breaks Britain, unfortunately. Post-war Britain is in a shambles. They're exhausted from the war. They're deeply in debt. They have to continue rationing for a decade longer than the United States. It's the mid-50s before they finish off the last of the rationing in Britain. They're facing demands for independence from various parts of the empire, including Egypt and India and some of their Caribbean islands and their African states and things. They all are looking for independence. And so their position as the dominant world power is fading really fast. Now, nature abhors a vacuum, so somebody's going to have to fill that power vacuum that's being left by Britain's recession, by Britain receding away from that role. And so it's got to be either the United States or the Soviet Union. And so in the West, at least, America is definitely going to be the nation that steps up and takes that role on. And we take on the role of international leadership of the Western nations. We start, virtually immediately when we start to prop up the anti-communist forces in Greece in their own civil war in the 1940s. After the British pull back, they just can't they can't keep their forces extended that far any longer. And so the United States will end up doing it. And then there's the Marshall Plan. And this is a plan to restore Europe. And it was an American idea, and it's hugely important to the development of particularly Western Europe. And this is the gentleman who created the Marshall Plan and for whom it's named. He used to be a general. His name is George C. Marshall. He was actually, during World War II, the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, which means he was the top general of the whole Army. He was in charge of all Army operations, reported to the Secretary of War, and from there to the President. But he was the highest military officer in the U.S. Army throughout the war. His job was to make sure that the Army had everything it needed to win the war. And so obviously he did a good job of that. We won the war. Now he's retired from the military and he becomes Truman's Secretary of State, because one of the things he was very good at was dealing with the militaries of other countries. And he was a big student of history. And he looked back and he thought about the things that had helped these radicals take over in Europe between the wars. And he says, we're not going to let that happen again. He says, we're going to avoid this economic disaster that is looming. And it was in Europe. Europe's economy was about to just drop out of the bottom. And he says, I've got a plan to rebuild the European economy, but it's going to be expensive. It's going to cost a lot. And for that reason, it was $13 billion in 1940s money. So that's, just probably over $1 trillion in modern money. Anyway, so he proposes this plan, and he does it for a couple of reasons. One is definitely actually humanitarian. He wants to help these people. He doesn't want to see people starving. One is that is definitely political. Okay, it's designed to help prevent the expansion of communism in the countries that weren't already under communist domination, because we wanted to avoid them getting into desperate straits and becoming radicalized, and so we wanted to avoid that whole thing again, much like how the Nazis had taken power in Germany. And now this is a Democrat president and a Democrat running the Secretary of State. Marshall was at least nominally a Democrat, and so this is a plan that, of course, the Republicans are going to be opposed to. Not least of all because it meant higher taxes and keeping taxes up after the war in order to pay for all of this. And then Stalin backs a coup in Czechoslovakia, which overthrows the government, which was already fairly leftist, and replaces it with essentially a communist dictatorship in 1948. And the Republicans get scared. And so they agree to do this. Now, Stalin will claim that what was really happening is that the U.S. is buying friends. He called it dollar imperialism. And refused to participate, would not let the Soviet Union or any of its SSRs take part in it, nor would he allow any of the other Eastern European states that he dominated to participate in it, even though they really needed the help very badly. A lot of the worst part of the war was fought over there in Eastern Europe, at places like Poland, and Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria, and all of that area was just devastated by the war. And here comes this opportunity to rebuild and providing jobs and food and materials and things. And Stalin says, we don't need that. He actually says, I have my own plan. And we'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, So the Marshall Plan gave loans at low rates. It provided direct aid, that is, we shipped tons of food, tons of equipment to start making things, machine tools and stuff. And it was to help recover industry in the West, and it works. It works very well, and the appeal of communist parties wanes. People are like, well, look, if we stay in these guys' good graces, if we stay on the American side, look at all the help they're giving us. We should do this. And the Soviet Union at the time could not really help anybody else. They were struggling to help themselves. But and at the same time, by putting people back to work, by creating jobs, by creating industries, what he's doing is he's also going to help stimulate trade for the United States. He's reopening these European markets now because people have jobs and things. They can make some money. That means they have money to spend, and they spend it buying American-made products as well. Okay, so it's not just humanitarian. It's not just political. It's also economic. This was a brilliant idea. I'm a big fan of the Marshall Plan. Another couple of really great political cartoons here. On the left side, you see the Herb Lock's famous cartoon about the Marshall Plan versus the Marshall-Stalin Plan, where on one side you see prosperousness, and on the other you don't. And if you notice, look at the plow that's being drawn. It's in a hammer and sickle shape, one of the symbols of the Soviet Union and communism in general as a result. And then you have another great one. This one's by Dorman Smith from Phoenix Gazette. And he shares this, and it's where the American taxpayer is helping Europe along towards self-support on the Marshall Plan. I think it's a really good example of how people felt, and essentially the concept of the plan. The first real conflict between the West and the Soviets is going to be over Berlin. And it's an era known as the Berlin Crisis. And it came very close to starting a war. It came very close to starting a war. And basically what's happening is that the West and the Soviets can't agree on a plan to reunify Germany. And the British, French, and the American zones have consolidated and are preparing to create a new German republic known as the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, most commonly referred to as West Germany. And at the same time, Marshall Plan funds are pouring into West Berlin, making it just look marvelous to the citizens of East Germany and East Berlin, who are looking, and many of them actually work in West Berlin. They would go work in West Berlin and then have to go back to their apartments in East Berlin, and they were looking at, the sort of terrible places they were living, and then go over to West Berlin and see all of the new buildings that were going up, all of the rebuilding that was going on as a result of the Marshall Plan and American aid, and just comparing the two, they simply didn't compare. And so thousands of people would sneak into West Berlin and then go off to West Germany from there. And Stalin, this looks bad. It's very embarrassing. So he decides he's going to starve the West out of Berlin to stop all of this. And so what he does is he starts stopping Western supply trains at the Soviet zone border. At the time, basically West Berlin got everything that they needed being shipped in from West Germany by train. And so when those trains arrived at the border between East and West Germany, the Soviet Union, their troops, and the East German troops stopped the trains, made them go back, wouldn't allow them to go to Berlin. The idea is, I'll starve these people out. They will voluntarily come over and become just part of Eastern Germany, and we'll stop all this nonsense, and I'll just keep all of the things that have already come in, and it'll make me look better, and it'll be great. And instead, what happens is that the British and the Americans start loading up World War II bomber planes and transport planes. They recall a bunch of pilots into service, and they start a massive airlift where they're flying just at planes at a constant, I believe at its peak, they had planes landing every 5 minutes or something like this. It's like a stream, like a train of planes through the sky, bringing in supplies into West Berlin. And they can just barely keep the city fed, okay? Every plane they could get their hands on, every pilot they could get their hands on, and they're just barely keeping ahead of starvation and epidemics and things like that, because they're bringing food and medicine and just the bare essentials is all they're bringing in, and they can just barely keep it up. They mention they manage to do it, however, and they fly this way for weeks and weeks. Stalin starts threatening to shoot down the planes. That's a direct act of war. He basically says, if you don't stop flying these things, then I'm going to shoot one down and we'll start a war. And the U.S. and the British say, well, you got to do what you got to do, pal. And we keep flying them in. Eventually, I mean, it gets so close to war, y'all. Eventually, what will end up happening is Stalin will back down, lift the blockades, and start allowing the trains to come back in, and West Berlin to stay in the hands of the West, as he had agreed on previously. One unintended effect of the Berlin crisis is the creation of NATO. And what happens is the nations of Western Europe are scared of Stalin and the Soviets. The Soviets are a huge country. They're rebuilding slowly but surely, and they're a juggernaut. Everybody knows it. And they say, look, if it's going to come to war, we need help. We can't fight these guys on our own. And so in April of 1949, the U.S. will enter its very first ever peacetime military alliance, which is known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, NATO. And at first, 12 nations, including the United States, the British, the French, the Netherlands, that's the Dutch, Belgium, Norway, Canada, Portugal, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, and Luxembourg, teeny Luxembourg, join in this organization. It's now 28 states, including West Germany and Turkey, and actually several former Soviet clients at this point. But basically, the agreement is that an attack against any member would be considered by all members as an attack against them. It's a mutual defense treaty. It also has rules about NATO nations agreeing to work together to improve cooperation between their militaries, practice maneuvers together under joint command. So you might have a French general, and he might have some American tanks and some British artillery and French infantry and some Dutch trucks and all of that. But because it's a NATO operation, it's all under the command of this guy who happens to be from France. Another thing that happens is they start to sort of standardize weapons systems and things, so that the guns of one country can shoot the bullets from another country. In other words, everybody wanted to shoot the same bullets the U.S. was using because we could make more than anybody else. And so we start creating, this is when we start seeing the shift towards using millimeters as designations for bullets for military purposes rather than inches as caliber, because of the cooperation with all of the Europeans. Of course, NATO is primarily created to defend Western Europe from a feared Soviet attack. For us here in the West, we look at it as a shield against the Soviets. That's not how Stalin sees it, though. And here's a map of NATO's expanding membership. The yellow countries were the original members. The green countries were added afterwards. And the sort of light green there was added after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the dark orange ones were the next group. You'll notice that Switzerland and Austria are not members. That's because Switzerland and Austria are neutral countries. They don't join either side. Politically and economically, they're more like the West, but they don't want to get pulled into all of this. And so they try to avoid it by staying neutral. Now, while the West saw NATO as a shield to stop Soviet expansion, to protect the West, Stalin saw it as a sword. He thinks it's a weapon to attack Russia. And so he responds in typical Stalin fashion. He responds by creating things to fight back. The first thing he does is he creates the Democratic Republic of Germany, the DRG, better known as East Germany. And he creates it and says it's officially no longer a Soviet occupation. We're here at the request of the local East German government to help protect them against Western aggression. And he creates Comecon, not the cool, fun thing that happens Comic-Con over in San Diego, or lots of other places now, just started in San Diego. But Comecon, the Committee for Mutual Economic Assistance. So ComEcon. It's basically a Soviet version of the of the Marshall Plan. And then the last thing he'll do is in 1955, he will create the Warsaw Pact. Well, he's dead, but Soviets will create the Warsaw Pact. And this is a military alliance between the Soviet Union, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, did I say Poland already? Bulgaria, and Albania. And essentially, they're going to do the exact same things that NATO does. They all promise that if anybody attacks any of us, we're all going to war with them. And they start doing standardization of weapons, and they start doing joint maneuvers. And it's also, by the way, a great excuse for the Soviets to keep soldiers in all of these countries to help make sure that they stay loyal to the Soviet Union, even though technically they don't really have to. They're technically independent nations. The reality is they're puppets. And they're not really necessarily comfortable with that. They don't necessarily really like that. But so here you get another map, and the yellow countries are the NATO nations at the time, and the pink is the Warsaw Pact nations. Okay, so you can see how they're separated. And Albania down there, if you see them, they're actually part of the pact at first. They will leave in 1961. They will actually exit the Warsaw Pact. The Soviets let them go because honestly, Albania is nothing. And so now we have essentially formalized the two sides, with NATO being on one side on the west, and the Warsaw Pact being in the east. And so we have two major alliances facing each other across a line that basically runs north to south all across Europe. And the term Iron Curtain is made to describe this. And Churchill didn't invent it. Nobody's really sure who used it first. The concept of the term is sort of just came into use, but it was most famously used and became very popularized after Winston Churchill gave a speech in 1946 at a college in Missouri. He's out of office at this point. He's been voted out, and he hasn't returned yet. And he says, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lay all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. He's just laying it out there. He's saying if you're east of the Iron Curtain, Moscow's really running things for you. You're not your own masters. Here is, to the right, you have a drawing of basically what the border zone between East and West Germany is. And at the bottom, you have West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, and at the top, you have Eastern Germany. And you can see where the border zone is. That's what Zonengrenze means, is border zone. And the road goes from Federal Republic of Germany all the way up to the border, and then it stops. The road is torn up and tore out, and they cut down all the trees, and they left a clear strip, and then there's another set of fences in where they put mines and barbed wire, and then another set of fences, and another 6-meter wide strip. These are called the death strips. If you're in it, they'll shoot you. If you're in it without permission, they just start shooting. With a watchtower, those would have been armed with machine guns and things. Trenches to keep vehicles from being able to just rush through it. Like I said, there's landmines and everything. And the area is basically just a strip that you just simply can't cross. And if you go into it, you're very seriously taking life in your hands. Up to 200 people, for example, were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall over the course of 28 years. Thousands made it across, but some 180, 200 people probably died trying to cross it. And that was an easy place to cross, relatively speaking. So this is pretty serious stuff. I have friends that in the 80s, I mean, they got stationed along these borders, and they would literally look over and see, Russian troops and East German troops just practicing. And it was like, one of these days they're going to come towards us, or we're going to go over there. It was quite scary stuff. From July of 1945 to September of 1949, the United States was the world's only atomic or nuclear power. We're the only country that had atomic weapons. And that's going to end in September of 49 when the Soviets test their first bomb. How did they get it? Well, they got it by spying. The Soviet Union had spies throughout the United States, and they had gotten material from the Manhattan Project to help. And several of the spies that were involved were caught, and 2 of them, a married couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, would later be tried for treason and executed by electric chair in the state of New York. And there's long been a controversy over how, whether they were actually guilty, how involved were they really all that big a deal, or were they just sacrificed to the idea of being strong on anti-communism, tough on communism. And the fact of the matter is, they were in it up to their eyeballs. Ethel had a cousin who worked at the Manhattan Project, and he got in touch with her. She got the materials from him, and her husband then was a courier helping to carry. They knew exactly what they were carrying and exactly who it was going to. And that was found out after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. got access to a lot of their old secret papers from the 40s and 50s. And it showed that, yes, these 2 were absolutely involved as part of a spy ring. And so the efforts of their children and grandchildren to clear their names have come to nothing because, well, they did it. So how does the U.S. respond to the fact that we're no longer the only atomic power in the world? Well, we respond by a mad scramble to build a bigger, better bomb, and develop longer range delivery systems. This is known as the New Look defense policy, and it's developed by President Eisenhower in the 50s. Eisenhower was elected in 48. And so it's Eisenhower's New Look defense policy. Eisenhower was elected in 52, not 48. Anyway, And what this results in is the development of the hydrogen bomb, the H bomb. One of the things the New Look defense policy did was it put more effort on nuclear deterrence. Okay, we were going to have bigger, better bombs and better ways of delivering them. And because of that, we wouldn't need so many soldiers and things. And so he actually starts reducing the size of the military while spending money on all these new bombs and things. And the idea being that if the Soviets started to attack us with their massive hordes of people, we would just nuke them. And so what we end up with is the hydrogen bomb, or H bomb. This is the first truly thermonuclear weapon. It's 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Japan. Literally 1,000 times more powerful, actually more than that. The A bombs dropped on Japan were measured in what are called kilotons, which is that the explosive power of 1,000 tons, that would be 2 million pounds, of TNT, high explosives. That's a kiloton. H bombs are measured in megatons. It's 1 million tons of TNT. So they're thousands of times more powerful than kiloton bombs. Anyway, we also end up developing ICBMs, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. That's what that stands for. These are missiles that can be fired from one continent and hit another. In other words, we can shoot them from the United States and hit the Soviet Union. We no longer have to get a plane through Soviet defenses in order to drop a bomb on a target. We just loft missiles. And nuclear missile submarines. Not only are we going to have missiles that can carry our bombs, but we're going to have submarines that can carry those missiles secretly so that you can't target them and try to take them out before we use them, which is the problem with the big missiles, the big ICBMs, which had to be put into big silos underground and everything, and you know, they were set in place, so they couldn't really be moved around easily, so everybody could kind of know where everybody else's was and target them and all that. The Soviets are going to follow suit. They're going to keep up with us, and they set off their first H-bomb only 9 months later. We set off our first H-bomb in November of '52, and the Russians will do it in August of '53. So they don't even take a full year to catch up. Now, the power of these new weapons is so massive that it's scary. And what happens is both the Soviets and the Americans look at, and they're both building these bombs as fast as they can, right? They look at it and they go, we can't use these, because if I use mine, they'll use theirs, and we'll both be destroyed. They'll retaliate, and we'll both be destroyed. This is an idea known as MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, and sometimes called nuclear deterrence, sometimes called nuclear stalemate. Basically, a nuclear power can't afford to go to war with another nuclear power, because the end result is annihilation for both. Because of this, the New Look goes away. The New Look defense policy has to go away. While we maintain our nuclear capability and we continue to improve it, and still do, the U.S. has to start rebuilding conventional forces again, because now we can't rely on the atomic bomb to wipe out all those Russians. Now we're going to have to be ready to fight them, and so we have to rebuild our conventional forces, building new tanks, enlisting new men into a larger army, building more ships and airplanes, and so on, to offset the Soviet Red Army. Now, the Soviets know that their stuff is not as good as ours. It's not as technologically advanced. They know it. They don't care. Their theory, and this is actual Soviet doctrine, is that they will have 3 to 1. If they've got 3 things for each one of ours, they win. Because while we might knock out 2 for every one of ours they knock out, then they still have 1 left.
Duck and cover. Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck. And then, you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
So, ever since the Soviet Union became the second country to join the so-called nuclear club, there have been several others that have as well, until they began signing anti-nuclear proliferation treaties. And most countries have signed on to these. Basically, they're promises that they won't try to develop nuclear weapons of their own. The most recent member is North Korea. They first tested a nuclear device in 2006. So the following countries, USA, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, China, India, Israel, South Africa, Pakistan, and North Korea are all countries that almost assuredly have or have had nuclear weapons. Israel is suspected, not confirmed. They have not admitted to anyone whether or not they've got nuclear weapons. My personal opinion, I believe that they do. South Africa first tested one in 1982, but voluntarily dismantled the few that they had. They only ever built 6. And in 1994, they voluntarily dismantled them and nuclear disarmed. It's the only country so far ever to have done that. Okay, so the election of 1948 rolls around. Truman is really the only guy the Democrats have. FDR is, of course, dead. Truman was not terribly popular, but as the incumbent, and because the Democrats really don't have anyone else more prominent than him that's willing to run, they run him again. And Truman's got some issues. He's being blamed for the fall of Eastern Europe to the communists, although it wasn't his fault. I mean, that happened during the war, really. And the party is going to split. The Southern Democrats will nominate a man named Strom Thurmond, who was a very strong segregationist from, I believe he's from North Carolina. It might have been South Carolina, but one of the two Carolinas. And then the left wing split off. That was the sort of right wing of the Democratic Party. And the left wing splits off and forms the Progressive Party. And because they don't think that Truman is living up to the ideals of the New Deal and FDR's vision of the social safety nets and things like that. And believe that, he's been he's already started persecuting the communists and other leftists, even within his own party. And so they're not happy with him either. So basically, it sounds like everybody's mad at Truman. And the Republicans are licking their chops. They think finally, it's 1948. It's been 16 years since we've had a Republican president. And we're finally going to win this one because they think Truman is a goner. And they run a fellow by the name of Thomas Dewey. He's a moderate Republican. And in 1944, during the war, he had run against FDR, who was one of the most popular presidents during his time that we've ever had. And he does well. He doesn't win, but he did well. And so the fact that he ran against one of the most popular presidents, FDR, that's why it gets one exclamation point, in 1944, during the midst of a war that we were winning by that point, That's why it gets 2 exclamation points, and he still does well. That's just astonishing. Okay, it's just extra astonishing and doubly extra astonishing in those cases. Truman, however, right towards the end, goes on a vigorous cross-country campaign, and he has 2 focuses. He says, we're containing communism, we're not letting it spread anymore. He attacks communism abroad, and then he attacks Republican obstruction domestically. He says we'd have gotten more done with social programs and things that people are asking for, but the Republicans in Congress have been blocking us. Now, modern day, we hear that all the time, and it's always been one of the things that the 2 political parties, whether it's the Democrats and the Republicans, or the Federalists and the Democrats, or the Whigs and the Democrats, or whoever, has accused the other of doing. So that's not a new thing, but he goes on this lightning campaign across country, and it helps. It really works. He wins in a narrow election. It's so close, in fact, that some newspapers actually ran that he had lost the election. And there's a photo here of the next day where the Chicago Daily Tribune had printed their newspapers saying Dewey defeats Truman in what is one of the biggest goofs in modern times, at least, by a major newspaper headline. So he does manage to win, and he does that by bringing together a coalition of voters from a lot of different backgrounds. He gets Northern blacks, he gets the unions, so he's got the working class, he's got some of the moderate business owners and more leftist business owners. He's got a lot of the intellectuals behind him, and so he puts together kind of a coalition to help get him elected, and wins in a very close election. Now, we've discussed before how what it means to be liberal has changed over the course of years. Classical liberalism back at the start of the United States was basically Jeffersonian democracy. Small government, very laissez-faire sort of capitalist system. Then we've gone through the progressive era, and then we moved into the New Deal liberalism. And now we're moving into an era where liberalism is changing once again. It's called Cold War liberalism, and it's characterized by a moderate liberal domestic policy, similar but not as widespread as the New Deal's domestic policy of a welfare state, where there was a sort of social safety net, economic safety net underneath everyone, and strong foreign and domestic anti-communism. And so, for example, it's going to develop the containment policy. It's going to put a lot of pressure on resisting so-called subversives within the United States. And like all compromise positions, nobody's really happy about this. People more to the right, they think that it's not hard enough on communism and that it's too soft on social issues, that it goes too far. And people on the left think that it's their attempts to cut down on subversives are unconstitutional invasions of privacy and the rights of citizens. They think that it's not doing enough to revitalize the New Deal's welfare state ideals that had been cut back on largely as a result of the war and the expenses of the war, and that it doesn't do enough to allow for personal freedoms inside the U.S. And so Truman wasn't really happy with it. He had wanted to basically kick up the New Deal again and get tied to that. He was a believer in it. But because of the political realities of the time, if he had moved any further to the left with it, he'd have been tied to communism, and that was political suicide. And so instead, what Truman proposes is what's known as the Fair Deal. And he says, we're going to continue some New Deal programs like Social Security, minimum wage laws, things like that. And the Republicans in Congress did everything they could to block that. He promotes the GI Bill. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 is the first of them. That's the official name of it, but nobody calls it that. Really, they just call it the GI Bill. And it's going to peak under Truman with thousands of veterans attending colleges and universities. They get preferential loans, hiring preference for government jobs, more health care benefits. Truman's going to extend it to Korean War veterans. And part of the reason why they did this was because we needed those professionals. We needed college graduates. A huge proportion of the college graduates, male college graduates in America, had been killed in World War II, because to be an officer, generally speaking, you had to be a college graduate. So virtually every officer that died in the war, and quite a few American officers did die during the war, was a college graduate. Back in those days, not many people went to college. Even fewer actually graduated. So it took a massive toll on the number of people who were trained to be doctors and engineers and teachers and lawyers and all of these things. And we needed to get more of them. And so that was a big chunk, that was a big impetus behind this GI Bill. Truman did want to create a national health insurance program. Republicans blocked it. This is the same era when the British do begin to create their national health care system. And the NHS, which is the system that under which they live now, essentially. And had Truman been able to do it then, it's what we'd be used to now. I'm not saying it's better. I'm not saying it's worse. It's different. It seems to work for some people and not for others, but any system does that. I know there's a huge, it's a major political football these days, is whether or not we should have a national health system. You know, like I said, I personally think it's got advantages and disadvantages, but if Truman had done that, then it would just be kind of what we were used to and nobody would be arguing about it. But that's true of anything. Okay? Truman would also push affordable housing programs, and that's going to help lead to the development of the modern suburb as more and more loans get made out to people with less and less income, and it helps to build some of the suburbs that are going to start developing around the country. And we'll talk about that more with the next chapter. Now, this Cold War conflict between the United States and the communists of Soviet Union and other countries is going to help to spark off a new Red Scare, where people start thinking that there's communists just everywhere. Now, there was some legitimate concern because there actually were communist spies living and operating in the United States. So there was a need for concern about it. I don't believe that it was ever as dangerous a threat as a lot of people believed that it was.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
Okay, so this sort of fear of subversive communist spies and agents within the United States is going to lead to persecution of people, really. There's plenty of evidence to show that the American government of the 30s and 40s really did have Soviet spies in it, and that the American society really did have Soviet spies in it. Alger Hiss, who I've mentioned a few times already, is the most famous of them within the government, at least. But Truman, because these things start coming out during his administration, that there's accusations that he's pro-communist, or members of his administration are pro-communist, and he's been totally infiltrated by the communists, he's going to issue Executive Order 9835. And what this does is it allows government officials to investigate any federal employee for so-called subversive activities. Basically anything that the government, they create loyalty boards within the various organizations of the federal government that look into people's backgrounds and look and see at how they act and what they do. And if they start acting strangely or suspiciously in any way just sort of out of the norm, they lose their jobs. And one group that was particularly targeted was for this was homosexuals, because of the heavy social stigma against homosexuality in that era. It was decided that gay men and lesbian women were a security threat, because that was a lever that someone could use to blackmail them. And so they fired gay and lesbian people in the government for being gay and lesbian. And of course, what that does is it actually makes that more leverage. If you not only will be socially ostracized, but will lose your job if it comes out that you're homosexual, then that gives the Soviets even more leverage on you than if it was just social stigma that you had to face. Now, social stigma is tough to go against. I get that. But it's totally law of unintended consequences. It actually makes things worse as far as making it a bigger deal and a stronger lever. Outside the federal government, a lot of private organizations and other governmental organizations, state level, for example, they do very similar things, and they start expelling, they start purging themselves of subversives. And again, a subversive is really anybody who people think might be working against the norms of the American way, which is sort of ridiculous in and of itself. But the CIO, for example, is going to throw out several unions because they feel that they are dominated by communists, and some of them were. The NAACP is going to kick out any of its members that were communists, who were called Reds, and they're so-called fellow travelers. These are people who aren't full-fledged members of the Communist Party, but maybe had a lot of sympathies with them, who get known as pinks, or fellow travelers. They sort of go along with the communists, or lean towards the communist lifestyle and way of looking at things and philosophies and such, but aren't necessarily full-fledged communists. And so EO 9835 legitimizes this fear of disloyalty. And so the House of Representatives is going to carry it one step further by expanding the operation of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had actually been created by a congressman named Martin Dees from Texas back in 1938 to basically investigate anybody who was acting against American interests. And they do hearings and things. And the most famous thing that they really get in on is allegations of communist infiltration of Hollywood, where they claimed that people were intentionally making films that were subliminally affecting the viewers with subtle pro-communist messages and things. And one of the crazy things that they do is they actually went after people who wrote movies during the war, or acted in movies during the war, or directed in some way were involved in movies that were made during the war that showed the Soviets in a positive light, because they were our allies during the war. And so the federal government pushed Hollywood at the time to make movies that said good things about the Soviets. And now, in the late 40s, early 50s, they start going after those people for being pro-communist. Well, isn't it true, sir? In 1942, you made a film called The Reds Are Our Friends. And the guy's like, well, yeah, but the government wanted us to. I mean, that sort of thing. And so they start having public hearings of allegations of communist infiltrations of Hollywood. A group of 10 writers and directors refused to testify. We're not going to tell you. They say, were you a member of the Communist Party? Well, I'm not going to tell you that. I refuse to tell you that. It's none of your business. I have a constitutional right to say what I want. I have a constitutional right to associate with whom I please, and have my own political beliefs, and I don't have to tell you nothing about it. 10 guys, 10 men, they were all men, are put in jail for contempt of Congress charges. Hundreds of actors, directors, and writers get blacklisted as a result, when they either name names, or their name gets named, or they refuse to name names. Probably the most famous of those actors was a fellow named Charlie Chaplin, who some of you may have heard of, some of you may not have. It was a long time ago. He actually ended up having to leave the country because he wasn't actually an American citizen. He was a British subject. So he ended up having to go back to England and never came back to the United States. Other people went along and cooperated fully and named names, including a young man, actor named Ronald Reagan, who had just been elected president of the Screen Actors Guild. That's the union for Hollywood actors, SAG. And he was like, yeah, we don't believe in communism, and we have some members that do, and here's their names. This fellow Ronald Reagan will later get more involved in politics and become elected governor of California, and president of the United States from 1981 to 1989, elected in 80 and 84. These hearings are very highly publicized and get a lot of publicity for the members of the committee. And that's going to be really important leading into the next round of accusations and sort of witch hunt style anti-communism.
At home, Americans feared red subversion. Congress revived the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1947, the committee investigated Hollywood, factory of America's imagination.
Have you ever observed any communistic information in any scripts?
Well, I have turned down quite a few scripts because I thought they were tinged with communistic ideas. They haven't attempted to use me, I don't think, because apparently they know that I'm not very sympathetic to communism.
There has been a small group within the Screen Actors Guild which has consistently opposed the policy of the Guild board and officers, or the Guild itself, as evidenced by the vote on various issues.
That small clique has been referred to, has been discussed as more or less following the tactics that we associate with the Communist Party.
10 witnesses, the Hollywood 10, defied the committee's right to ask about their beliefs.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I am framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
Then you
answer to
denied-
a question
then
which
you-
invades his, absolutely invades
Then
his
you
right.
denied, you refuse to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will
All right.
offer my beliefs, my affiliations, and
Here's the
everything
witness.
else
Here's the
to
witness.
the American public, and they will know where I stand, as they do from what I have written.
Stand away
I have
from the
written
stand.
for Americanism for many years, and I shall
Stand
continue
away from the
to
stand.
fight for the Bill of Rights, which you are
Officer,
trying to
take
destroy.
this man away from the stand.
Others from the film industry demonstrated their support for the constitutional rights of the 10.
Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I believe I have the right to be confronted with any evidence which supports this question. I should like to see what you have.
Oh, well, you would.
Yes.
Well, you will pretty soon. The witness is excused.
The 10 were imprisoned. With hundreds more, they were blacklisted, their livelihoods taken away.
And so McCarthyism becomes a thing. It's named for Senator Joseph McCarthy, Republican junior senator from Wisconsin, who his political career is sort of floundering. He's not doing too well. And so he's trying to give it a shot in the arm to really pump it up and make it stronger. And what he does is he decides he's going to be the guy that everybody knows for being strong on communism and trying to, really crack down on all of that and take advantage of this Red Scare. Now, the Red Scare is partially being promoted by the media. It's certainly being promoted by the government, and it's very much a thing. And so in February of 1950, he's giving a speech, and he claims that he has and this is a quote, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. Basically, he's saying that the Secretary of State, and by extension the President, knows that there's communists working in the State Department and that they are working against the interests of the United States, and yet they still have their jobs. And why is that? It only could, basically hinting that the only reason that could be is that the Secretary of State and by extension the President of the United States want them to do that. Here's the thing. The list doesn't exist. It's a myth. Made it up. The list changes. It's totally faked. He then gets put on as head of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, basically the Senate's version of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which he can't sit on, of course, because he's a senator, right? And he's not a member of the House of Representatives. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee will wage a smear campaign based on virtually any rumor, but he specifically targets Democrats and anyone who speaks out against him or the tactics he's using. And they just tar everybody. And what he does is he builds a climate of real political fear. I mean, people's political careers are being ruined by this man. People's jobs in government, they're losing their jobs left, right, and center. People run scared from this dude, and he loves it. He's got tons of attention. He's on the front of the newspapers. He's in Time magazine. He's being interviewed for radio, and TV is just becoming a thing. He's getting on TV and being interviewed. And, he's thinking, man, I'm going to run for president. I'm going to be president of the United States. And there were people who wanted this. And he's got tons and tons of popular support until he takes on the U.S. Army. He moves away from the State Department and moves on the Army. And his hearings are televised, live televised. And his methods shock Americans, how he badgers the people that he's supposed to be investigating and harasses them and speaks over them and just refuses to really do any investigation. As far as McCarthy is concerned, these people are already guilty. And the people working for the Army very calmly and rationally say, no, sir, that's not the case. That's not true. And he said, well, isn't it true that you did this, that, or the other? And the guy looks at him straight in the eye and says, no, that's not true. Heck, one guy even went so far as to say, have you no decency, sir? You've ruined people's reputations without a scrap of evidence. Have you no decency? Which really made him mad. So the utter lack of solid evidence, though, caused a major backlash. McCarthy himself will be censured by the Senate. He'll be voted out of office. He loses all of his credibility, all of his power, and it just disappears virtually overnight once this gets out. And he'll then actually end up dying a few years later of cirrhosis of the liver. He drank himself to death. Meanwhile, while this is going on in Europe and America, there are some really interesting developments taking place in Asia as far as the Cold War is concerned. So let's chat about that for a minute. Now, China's been involved in a civil war between the nationalists under a fellow by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, who had sort of taken power in 1911, and the communists, who have come under the control of a fellow by the name of Mao Zedong. And they've been doing this since before Japan invaded in 1931. Now, during the war, from 1931 until 1945, they largely fought the Japanese. They didn't fight each other as much. Wherever they ran into each other, they shot at each other. But they basically, the communists controlled one part of the country and the nationalists controlled another. The Japanese were in both parts, and so both sides did their best to knock the Japanese out of the war. Now, the U.S. is backing the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. For example, to help out the nationalists, the U.S. government sent a variety of aircraft over, P-39s and P-40 Warhawks and such, and volunteer pilots who used to be in the Air Force, but then gave up, resigned their commissions, and found themselves in China, surprisingly, right afterwards. And they become members of what was known as the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers. And so they flew in support of the nationalists against the Japanese. And later, some of them fought against the communists for the nationalists because they basically became mercenaries. So while the U.S. does support the nationalists with large sums of money and big loans and plenty of equipment and all of this stuff, the communists do their best to win over the people of China. And by doing that, they take over China. The nationalists lose. In 1949, Truman finally abandons the losing nationalists. To be honest, Chiang Kai-shek was not a real nice dude. Anyway, and so they were losing. And so Truman basically abandons them. The remaining nationalists will flee to Taiwan, where they create what's known as the Republic of China. And on mainland China, the communists establish what becomes known as the People's Republic of China. By the way, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, still considers Taiwan to be basically a rebellious province. And actually should be part of the PRC. And at first, of course, the Chinese had been getting help from the Soviets, their communist buddies, their communist cousins. But the fact of the matter is, the Russians and the Chinese don't like each other, and they really never have. They share a very long border, and they have fought many times against one another. They just don't care for each other much, and so as soon as the Chinese basically get their feet underneath them, they turn away from the Soviets and start developing their own. Truman, meanwhile, is going to be blamed for losing China because he abandoned the nationalists. The fact of the matter is the nationalists had lost. Mao Zedong had massive support from across large chunks of the country. He had the numbers, and it was that simple. It was always going to be the communists, whether Truman had stuck with Chiang Kai-shek or not. So from China to Korea. Now, if you remember your geography, Korea is a peninsula right next to China and just sort of north and west of the Japanese islands. It had been at one time a province of the Empire of Japan. They had taken it over and annexed it. Of course, they lose Korea after the war is over. Korea has been divided along the 38th parallel of latitude, 38 north, after World War II. And that's because the Soviets had marched down the peninsula from the north, and the U.S. and the Japanese had held on to the southern half of the peninsula. And so when the war ended, the U.S. said, you guys stop. And they sort of did the same thing there in Korea that had happened in Germany. And they said, okay, the area that the Soviets are in, that's going to become the Soviet zone, and the area to the south, that's going to become the American zone. And a man by the name of Kim Il-sung took power in the north. He then did the typical communist thing and begins to ruthlessly suppress dissent. He begins censoring papers and institutes a widespread propaganda campaign in which he says that the South Koreans are the puppets of the Americans and the Japanese are their allies. Now, Koreans did not like Japanese at the time. Japan, while they had ruled Korea, had treated Korea very, very badly. There are still a lot of people that have grudges against the Japanese over there. It's not as bad as it used to be back in the old days. But anyway, so what happens is that so Kim Il-sung sets up a communist dictatorship in the north with the support of the Soviets and the Chinese. Again, as the Chinese pull away from the Soviets, Sung sorts of leans on the Chinese because, well, China is literally next door, and they have to be on good terms with the Chinese. In the South, the U.S. sets up a democracy in what's called the Republic of Korea, and the ROK. And the U.S. will also guarantee their independence. Now, theoretically, the two countries are supposed to have an election to decide, or actually it's not an election, it's called a plebiscite, and where they will vote and decide what kind of government they want to unite back under and be one big happy Korea. And this has never happened. Since 1945, that has not happened. By June of 1950, Kim Il-sung has convinced his communist, Soviet, and Chinese sponsors that he can win a war to reunite the country. He says, you have given me enough equipment and trained my soldiers and my pilots and everyone so well that we will surprise them with an attack and invade South Korea, and before anyone else can get involved, we will have captured it and made Korea whole, and it will be all communist, and we'll be spreading world communism. And of course, the Soviets and the Chinese liked that idea. And so on June 25th, 1950, to the surprise of the United States and most other countries, Kim Il-sung's army starts marching south, and they invade South Korea. The response by the United Nations, remember they exist to keep wars from happening, is to pass Security Council Resolution 83, which authorizes UN member states to organize a military intervention to stop North Korean aggression. Basically, the United Nations declares war on North Korea, and it goes through the Security Council. So why didn't the two communist countries boycott or veto it? Well, The Soviet Union was off pouting, or pardon me, they were boycotting the UN at the time. So they weren't there. Their representatives weren't there, and they could not veto the resolution. And China at the time was represented by the Republic of China, or Taiwan, not the PRC, not Communist China. And so they were in favor of it. Anything that hurt North Korea was a good thing as far as the Republic of China was concerned. And so we have the Korean War. The Korean War is America's tie as far as our military record is concerned. We've got one tie and one loss, really, and the loss is Vietnam. But Korea is a tie. And essentially, the North Surprise attack almost wins. They advance way down to the south. You can see all of this on the map there to the right. They push all the way down. They capture the capital of South Korea, which is Seoul, and they move further and further and further south. And they push all the way down to an area around the city of Busan, which the line there where the South Koreans finally held, with some help from U.S. troops that were hurriedly sent there and other UN troops. Australians and British and French went. I think the Dutch sent some. Japan did not. Japan didn't have any defense forces at this time. Well, they had a small defense force, but they certainly didn't have any troops that could go overseas. Anyway, so they almost win. Kim Il-sung was close to being right, but the UN forces, mostly U.S., most of the troops fighting on the UN side were U.S. forces, landed behind the North Korean armies at a place called Incheon, which is near Seoul. And so they're threatening to cut off the communists down in the south from all of their supplies coming down from the north, which means, of course, that they'll be surrounded and they'll run out of food and weapons and ammunition and such, and that they'll be forced to surrender. So with that threat to cut them off, to cut the army off and then attack North Korea at leisure, the North Korean army retreats. They pull back to North Korea, and the South Koreans follow, and so do the rest of the UN troops. And they manage this time to push the North Koreans all the way back up to near the Yalu River, which is the border with China. Okay, so it starts with the North Koreans pouring into the south by surprise and almost taking over all of South Korea, and then the South Koreans with the UN troops push north, and they push and they push and they push until they just about push them all the way out of the country in November of 1950. But that triggers help for the North from China, and the Chinese start pouring in thousands and thousands and thousands of Chinese soldiers. And they push these guys back again, and they end up near the 38th parallel, just slightly north of it. Okay, the lines move south one more time. Now, the guy running the show over there, at least at first, is a fellow by the name of MacArthur. Yep, same guy, Doug MacArthur, Dugout Doug. He had been military commander of Japan. Basically, the general, his title, I believe, was Governor General. He basically had been running Japan since the armistice, or since the end of the war. And he is running the show for the UN war against North Korea. And he wants to use atomic weapons. He wants to the Chinese and North Koreans use human wave attacks where literally 10,000 people come charging at you. There's so many that you can't kill them all. You just don't have enough bullets to do it with. And their plan is to just grind South Korea into the dust. MacArthur says, well, to prevent that, let me nuke them. And Truman, who is still president, says, no, we're not doing that again. We're not nuking somebody. These weapons are horrific. And by this time, word is really just starting to spread and get out about, how bad the after effects of being around a bomb are. And MacArthur will complain publicly. Now, you got to remember, the president is MacArthur's boss. He's the ultimate commander-in-chief of all U.S. military personnel. You don't go around talking bad about your boss in the newspapers. Look what happened to Patton when he did that. Same thing happens to MacArthur. He gets fired. Truman fires him, and he retires. So a stalemate will settle in and very near the original border. And this is as early as 1950. Right at the end of 1950, they basically are right back where everybody started. Eisenhower, meantime, will get elected in 52, and he starts to push an armistice in 53. The result is that they will return to essentially the original demarcation line. There's that truce line in 1953 drawn there. South Korea gets a slightly larger chunk of land, but nothing significant, nothing major. They establish a demilitarized zone between the two countries, which, if I recall correctly, is about 14 miles wide, where no one is allowed to live, no military or police forces are allowed to go into it. They both patrol their sides of the DMZ. They have barbed wire fences and walls and machine gun pill boxes and tons of soldiers up there, both sides, kind of eyeballing each other across it. Well, not literally. I mean, they're too far away to see each other by eye, but they still do this. Korea is still divided and technically still at war and still staring at each other over the most heavily mined stretch of land in the world. Prior to World War I, the Middle East was essentially an ignored region. They had not discovered the one thing that the area really had to offer to a modern industrialized world, which is oil, of course. Since the discovery of oil there, however, of course, the Middle East has taken on an entirely new strategic significance in the world. And that's true militarily, but also economically, because our economies are based on energy. The basis of our energy system currently is oil. So it makes the Middle East a very important region, as hopefully you all already know. So the Middle East and control of its oil becomes a major concern in the post-war years. Now, there are a lot of Arab nations in this area that are less than fond of the West. There are a lot of Muslim nations in that area that are less than fond of the West, because not all of them are Arabs. The Iranians, for example, aren't ethnically Arab. They're Persians. Egyptians aren't ethnically Arab. They're Egyptians. But anyway, the point is that they have some fairly good reasons for not being terribly friendly towards the West, because when oil was first discovered there, Western European nations in the United States pretty much just grabbed it. Certainly a few people at the top of the food chain there in the Middle East got very wealthy as a result, but most of the people, it really didn't help that much, and over time they began to feel very much like we were taking advantage of them. One of the most powerful nations in the region, especially in the early days of this era, is Egypt. And they turn against the West over two things mainly. One was the design and building construction of a dam on the Nile, which was designed to help control the flooding of the Nile River Valley, and also at the same time to generate electrical power. And essentially, the U.S. and Western European countries didn't really support that idea, where the Egyptians really wanted to do it. And so they got technical assistance from the other main source of that in the world, the Soviets. And the other was control of the Suez Canal, which the British basically owned and didn't want to give up because it's a vital link between India and all of the Asian colonies that the British still had and Great Britain. So they wanted to keep control over Suez. It's a pretty important waterway. Well, Egypt looked at it and said, well, but it's in our territory. We want to control it. And so there was a lot of disagreement over that. So basically, Egypt begins trying to balance between the East and the West, between the communists and the Western capitalist democracies. And that's a tricky balancing act. Really, about the only other country that was trying to do that, honestly, was Yugoslavia, and they didn't do a very good job of it. They were a communist nation run by a dictator by the name of Tito Brosip, and Tito hated the idea of being dominated by the Soviet Union, and so he wouldn't fall into their sphere of influence, and yet he was a communist dictator, and so the West wouldn't deal with him either. Yugoslavia ended up poor. Egypt, however, does not end up poor because of control of the Suez, oil, and other resources that they've got. So Egypt does a pretty good job of that. In response, however, to Egypt turning to the Soviets for assistance, Eisenhower is going to announce that the United States from that point on would support any nation in the Middle East that needed help against international communism. In other words, if you can convince the U.S. government that the people that you have a beef with are communists or pro-communist or would like to be communists or will accept help from the communists, then the U.S. will support you against them. And this is going to lead us to support people like Jordan's King Hussein, who wasn't a terribly bad guy. It's going to lead us to support a pro-American government in Lebanon, where there will be a lot of problems. And it's going to lead to us supporting the Shah of Iran, who is not a really nice guy. He's actually kind of a terrible person, but he was very strongly anti-communist. So we supported him anyway. And that's going to lead us to have a lot of problems later on in the 70s, which you may or may not have ever heard of. The last of the areas we're going to talk about today is Vietnam. We're not going to go into the whole Vietnam War at this point. We're just talking about sort of the setup for it. We'll talk about the Vietnam War later on. But after World War II, Vietnam is going to be divided into North and South. Again, very much like what had happened with Korea, except that the northern part of Vietnam was controlled by the Chinese communists, and the southern part would be controlled by the pro-democracy government. And so the French come back to reclaim their old colony. And we support them because the leader up in the north is a communist by the name of Ho Chi Minh. He had actually begged Truman to protect Vietnam's national sovereignty. He said, look, just, you talk about Wilsonian self-determination. We don't want the French back. Let us just rule ourselves. And Truman, of course, couldn't allow that because that would make him look soft on communism, because Ho Chi Minh was a communist. And so the Viet Minh, who had been the nationalist rebels against the Japanese, who had invaded during World War II, resumed their struggle for independence. And this time it's going to be against the French, starting in 1946. So it basically starts just right away. Eisenhower, after Truman's out, Eisenhower's in. Eisenhower's going to continue to support the French, believing in an idea called the domino theory. And this is the idea that if Vietnam falls to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would as well. So Cambodia and Laos and Thailand would all eventually fall to communism. just like dominoes falling in a row, right? You knock one over and they... Anyway, so in 1954, the French will lose a battle in a place called Dien Bien Phu. It was actually a siege. And that's really the last stronghold that the French had in Vietnam. And so they agree to leave. And part of the deal is that Vietnam will be divided again, that they'll create a demilitarized zone between the halves again. And then they will hold reunification elections in 1956 is the plan. And this time, however, a pro-American government set up in South Vietnam refuses to call the elections. He calls them off because the leader, a guy by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was not a nice guy, was really not popular, certainly not as popular as Ho Chi Minh, he calls off the elections and says, nope, we're not going to have them because the communists will cheat and win it. They didn't need to cheat to win it. The communists would have won it. Diem was just not well liked. Anyway, so again, we're going to support this government, the Diem regime, because it is anti-communist. The thing is, Diem wasn't so much anti-communist as pro-Diem. He was all about, look, I'm the guy in charge and I get to be the president and I'm in power and I'm going to get wealthy and I'm going to bank all the country's money in my numbered Swiss bank account and eventually I'll just take off and move to Switzerland and live a lovely, rich lifestyle. And the heck with Vietnam. And so he's not popular for that reason. Go figure. Anyway, so that's setting up, and we begin to support the Diem government by sending over some military advisors. And at first, Eisenhower only sends a few hundred. These people are training the South Vietnamese army. Okay, getting them, sends them some equipment, half-tracks and jeeps and some guns and things, and starts training them on how to use that equipment more organized and modern and larger scale military techniques. And that's what we begin, how we begin our involvement in Vietnam. Of course, you know that it's going to escalate over the next 2 decades. Okay, so that's going to do it for today. I know this was a very long one, but what we're really going to be doing is essentially 3 classes over 4 class days or class periods that we would have done. So this is one of the 3 of our last 3 chapters that we're going to cover for the rest of the semester. And so go ahead and look for the quiz and make sure that you take that. The next thing we're going to talk about is going to be the 50s in the U.S. and sort of more social and less political. Talk about the rise of the middle class and basically what amounts to a fairly golden era in American history. But and then we're going to finish up with civil rights. And that is pretty much the plan and what we're going to do. So we'll catch you next time. Thanks. Goodbye.